There are obviously a myriad of scrapes that are available for bassoon reed. These are two sort of hypothetical types of scrapes we have on the bassoon reed. The parallel scrape features a quick sort of tip area and then is largely, in its more accentuated form, from the heart all the way back, is pretty much the same thickness. Now obviously you have reeds that are a compromise of these two. The slope shape, again, you've got the tip area, but from the heart area it slopes on up to where we find the bark or the area of the first wire. And as I mentioned, some of the sloped or pyramid shapes will not feature a collar at all, or an abrupt area in this area here. I prefer the term sloped, and I'll be using that in here, but we have other reed makers that prefer the term pyramid as their shape for that. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the aperture of the reed. The aperture is what you see when you look at the tip of the reed, or the opening of the reed. And here we have two different types of apertures. We have one aperture that basically is a single curve, and then we have another aperture where we have a curve that reverses direction. See right where the arrows point? We've got a change in direction, a little more complex curves to this particular type of aperture, and we call this area of change the point of inflection. And these two reed types will vary in the type of reed response, the type of response you'll have, and they do produce different types of reeds that we'll discuss later on in this video series. Now when we're talking about aperture, we can talk about the height of the aperture, and that's the distance between the two blades in the middle point of the reed. That's the tip opening that's the largest. And we can also talk about the width of the aperture. That is the point at which air is allowed to still go into the reed. You see right here at the edge here where it's all black, that part of the reed is not allowing through air, and that part is not participating at least as much in vibration, but this part is allowed to freely vibrate as so in the center section. So when we talk about its aperture width, this is the width that is actually vibrating as a surface. Well, this becomes important, particularly for the reed with points of inflection. You can see how in number 1, 2, and 3, the width of the aperture, as well as the height, varies considerably. And in fact, this is the fantastic thing about a bassoon reed, particularly one with points of inflection, is you are creating, as it were, multiple reed shapes, multiple reed sizes. And by reforming your embouchure on the reed with various pressures of your embouchure on the reed, you're actually changing the vibrational surface area of the reed. So here we're looking on, and obviously this is a little bit too open as a reed aperture. You probably won't find many reeds that will work with an aperture like that, but it's highly stylized just so you get the idea. So we've got a large aperture here, and you know that the width of the aperture is greater than the width of this aperture. And here we've got a much smaller aperture width. So the vibrational area of this particular reed, this number 3 aperture, is right in this area. This part does not participate as much in the vibration. If we look at the lay of the reed, I think we'll begin to understand again this vibrational surface. So what I showed is number 1 had the aperture that was from here to here, and you can see this black area here in number 1 was not participating in that vibration, but everything else was freely vibrating and was participating in that particular reed opening. Now as that reed opening closed to the second aperture, this second shaded area was closed off here and here, and neither of these vibrated freely, and this area all vibrated freely. And then in the third area, you can see is all in white, how we've got a different lay of the reed vibrating. We'll discover later that the smaller the vibrating area of the reed, the more it favors the higher register. The larger the vibrating area of the reed, the more it favors the low register. So really the number 1 aperture would be where you're playing with as loose an embouchure as possible, generally playing in the low register. The number 3 aperture would be where your embouchure has exerting more force on the reed, and therefore is playing more of the high notes in the higher register. If we look at a reed with no points of inflection, it's different in that although the aperture height changes, there is generally little difference in the width of the aperture. So the reeds without points of inflection, despite the fact that you increase the embouchure pressure on the reed, it still freely vibrates along a large surface area. Now, so here's a comparison side by side with the openings of the reed. And again, you can see that reed number 3, we got a very small aperture here with a reed with inflections, with points of inflection, and then still a pretty large aperture. The height has changed, but again, the width is pretty much the same for that particular reed aperture. I want to also just talk about a couple of other terms that we need to have in this particular video series. When we're talking about wire adjustments, and let me go back to my reed here. If you round out a wire, that will be rounding out, that will be making the tube rounder. That would be squeezing with your pliers on each side of the reed. If you flatten the wire, that's squeezing on this point, and then the opposite side actually closing the wire down. And that rounding and that flattening of the wires will be an important concept that we'll have later on in our video series. Amen.